a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Well, according to the Coffee Championship of the Universe, Organic Man coffee is the best, which means Julio is brewing the best coffee in the universe. 4501 McPherson is where you can pick up a cup or a bag of coffee that will make your life better. Well, maybe not better, but it sure will get your day going. Can I prove any of this? No, but Beelzebubba says it's the best. And do you really want to argue with him? The former minion of evil? If you're not in Laredo, you can get the best coffee in the universe at organicmancoffeetrike.shop. My wife and I went out to dinner the other night, and somehow I got onto the subject of the ultimate warrior, the homeless guy, not the wrestler. This guy was entertaining. He never fought with anyone. He just went through life living at his own speed. He had long black hair down past his shoulders that probably could have used a washing or two. Maybe a trip through the car wash would have helped. His mustache hung down in a Fu Manchu. He was very round. Considering he ate out of dumpsters, he was quite corpulent. His legs were skinny. You would think a guy that big would have more buttocks. His cheeks were nearly non existent. I wish I didn't know this, but that which has been seen. When I say alien, I'm not talking about beings from outer space. I'm referring to folks in our country illegally. I know it's not politically correct term, but it was the legal definition when I went to the academy. An alien, anyone who is not a citizen or resident of the United States. I am not a social worker. My job was to enforce immigration law and help out other law enforcement officers if asked. Laredo had a few agencies to deal with folks with shaky grasp on reality. MHMR was overcrowded and had to release anybody not deemed a public safety hazard. The Bethany House could only take in so many people. The Salvation Army was at their limits as well. All of the following stories are true, with little embellishment. I can't remember the first time I saw the Ultimate Warrior. He was kind of always there on the street corner or under an overpass. Most agents had a few words with him over time. The law said we had to prove alienage to return them to Mexico. Usually this was easy. You either saw the person crossing or there was enough probable cause to question them. Many times I simply asked a person if they were in the country illegally, and after a few minutes they would break. It wasn't hard. You develop skills to know when the person was lying. I was never mean to any aliens as long as they were decent to me. I would ask where they were from, and as the conversation progressed, I would remain polite as long as they responded in kind. I also knew better than to trust anybody until I had developed their character. When dealing with the Ultimate Warrior, no matter what you asked, he would always say yes. You could ask him, "Are you from Mexico?" He would say yes. You would ask him, "Are you from Mars?" And he would say yes. You would ask him, "Are you here illegally?" And he would say yes. Every question, the only answer was yes. And the funny thing is, if you asked him a question in Spanish, he would just nod his head. I don't know that he spoke Spanish. A classmate of mine didn't have any encounters with the Ultimate Warrior until we were down in Zapata. The agents down there were having trouble finding aliens. Each month they would submit their stats, and they were always low, sometimes as low as zero. Our boss decided we would head down there and help them find some aliens. We set up a checkpoint and we were able to arrest several dozen people. Jimmy was driving around the perimeter of our location looking for walkers. Drivers would see us up ahead and they would drop their passengers off so they would walk around to the point. If caught, nobody went to jail because we couldn't prove a smuggling case. Jimmy came driving up to the point with someone in the back seat. How he got the Ultimate Warrior in the back seat is a wonder. I looked, and there sat the Ultimate Warrior. How he got to Zapata, I don't know. Our supervisor said, "Let's get him out of the vehicle." Having worked the last several years behind a desk, he didn't know who the Ultimate Warrior was. It took all four of us, two pulling and two pushing, to get the guy out of the back seat. He didn't resist, he just went limp. It was like trying to drag a 300-pound sack of wet cement. I'm going to call him UW from now on. Ultimate Warrior is kind of a lot of wording. UW was finally standing on the side of Highway 83. He was holding a huge family-sized box of chicken bones. As he stood there, he would pull a bone out and nibble off any remaining flesh. The bone would then go back into the box. With one hand holding the box and the other maneuvering the chicken bones, there was nothing holding his pants up. So gravity took over. There he stood, showing his physique to the world. People driving by would slow way down to gawk at what was a scene from a comedy. Our supervisor was trying to tell UW to pull his pants back up. So UW dropped the chicken box while trying to get his rear side covered. This led to him bending over to recover his food, which only enhanced the viewers passing by to a treat they wished they hadn't seen. The whole time I'm trying to convince the supervisor it was impossible to establish citizenship when dealing with UW. When no acceptable solution was readily available, Jimmy was told to take UW back to where he found him. I don't know how Jimmy got the guy out of the back seat because it took all four of us to get him in there. About an hour later, Jimmy came back to the checkpoint. He didn't look real happy with his lot in life that day. We packed up the point and went back to Laredo. The Sabata agents were quite thoroughly annoyed at us going down there and catching aliens for them. They had sworn there were none to be had, and we had proved them wrong. This was back when things were done a lot differently in the patrol. You do that today, and everybody would wind up on the rubber gun squad. I wish this was the end of the story, but wait, there's more. Months later, we were working midnights. I loved midnight shift because A, there was hardly any traffic downtown, which made driving around a heck of a lot easier, and B, I got to Coast with Art Bell. We were doing a slow roll along Lincoln Street. There was an old building under construction. The front was wide open. As we passed, I saw what looked like a dead body lying just inside the front doors. We stopped to find out if we had to call for an ambulance or the police. A body was draped over a big pile of sand with the backside up in the air. At first, I thought maybe it had been a sexual assault, and this poor person was left as the assailant had positioned them. The sound of snoring let us know that the victim was still alive. Plus, we found out this was the ultimate warrior, sleeping. Why he was sleeping draped over a pile of sand with his rear in the air, naked, I don't know, and I don't think I want to know. I probably should have just driven off and finished the shift, but my sense of humor was unmanageable. We drove a few blocks over and then called Jimmy and told him that we were chasing a large naked suspect who was running north towards Lincoln Street. Chasing naked people in Laredo wasn't all that unheard of. A few minutes later, we drove over to where Jimmy was standing. After having seen the full moon over the sand pile, he told both of us what he thought of our little prank. As he was making a pile, oops, sorry, that's the wrong. How did that get in there? Anyway, chasing naked people through Laredo unfortunately happened a lot. One day at the airport, we would check people after they had gone through the x-ray machine to make sure that they were in the country legally. And as we're standing there, there's this bunch of windows along the side of the waiting line. We see the Ultimate Warrior step around behind this wall that is right outside the windows. And then he dropped his pants and he proceeded to do what he had to do. Number two, quite a lot of it. Everybody waiting to get on the plane to fly back to wherever they were heading. That was going to be their last view of Laredo. The Ultimate Warrior doing things in public that he shouldn't. What has been seen? Felipe did his time in Vietnam and came home missing a part of himself. He had a family, but soon his wife found that he was not the man that she had seen fly away to the other side of the planet. He wound up living with his folks for a while, but they both died within a year. He took up living on the island next to Bridge Number 2. I first encountered Felipe when checking out the island looking for aliens. He was sitting in the brush in head to toe camouflage, watching me as I walked about. I had that feeling of eyes on me, but I couldn't see anyone, and so I thought maybe it's just nerves. After all, I was a relatively new agent at the time. Eventually, I spotted him. Once my heart had slid back down my throat and I was able to breathe again, I asked him who he was. He told me he was on patrol. I may have been new, but I was certain that he wasn't one of ours. He told me he was very much an American and he was watching the river. I discovered he had built a bunker. You couldn't see it until you were right on top of it. Dug in with brush on top, clear fields of fire. Had Felipe been armed? As far as I know, he wasn't. There were wires strung out in all directions with cans with stones in them. Early warning system. After talking to him for a bit, I was struck by his eloquence. He spoke as if well educated and well traveled. Well, he had been to the other side of the planet. Over the next several years, I would run into Felipe in a bunch of locations, always along the riverbank. It turned out he liked Border Patrol agents, saying that we were like the soldiers he knew back in the day. Felipe had been raised in Laredo, and it turns out my wife's family knew his family. She knew him back when he had first gotten back from Vietnam. He had joined the Army because that's what good Americans did. He was sent to Vietnam and he managed to survive 2 tours over there. He was discharged and then returned home. Once back in the States, he began to have problems adjusting. After fighting for your life for a few years, suddenly being back in his hometown was too much of a change. He went back to living the way that he had when he was fighting for survival. Eventually, Felipe moved into an old bread delivery van parked right next to the wall at Fort McIntosh. He had a flagpole with the stars and stripes high overhead. He would swing by, or we would swing by and say hi from time to time and just check to see if there was anything he needed. I'm not sure if he found a new home, but I did see Felipe walking around in new clothes after a while. He had the handle from a golf club tucked into his belt like it was a sword. He didn't walk, he marched around town, maybe looking for the parts of his past that he had misplaced. I'm pretty sure that eventually he found himself and got on with his life. It's been several years since I've seen him. There was a black woman sitting on a park bench across from the bus station, right in front of the old library. She had on a brown, fuzzy house coat and high heels. She sat on that same bench for weeks. Working midnights, we cruised that area many times because aliens would gravitate to the bus station, hoping to get to San Antonio. These were the folks that didn't know about the checkpoint on I-35. The transportation van would make a trip to the checkpoint after each bus passed through. The woman would usually be sitting there giving the world a mean look. Once in a while, she would be walking back and forth, but she always stayed within a block of the bus station. Late one hot, steamy night, she was sitting on the bench with the house coat open, wide open. That which has been seen. She only had the house coat and high heels, nothing else. She was nothing like any bathing beauty. One more image burned into my mind that I can't seem to unsee. New agents would eventually ask why there were so many homeless people in Laredo. I knew the answer because I'd done some investigating. I knew a few San Antonio police officers and I had asked. The unofficial policy up north was any homeless people found living on the streets were taken to the bus station and given a one-way trip south. Laredo was 140 miles south, so this is where they wound up. If you ask any officers in San Antonio, they will laugh and say it's not true. What would you expect them to say? There was an old lady living in a tent just up the river from the railroad bridge. She wasn't a bad person, but she did interfere with operations once in a while. If we got out on foot to walk along the riverbank, she would see us and in a very loud voice invite us to come over for a glass of iced tea. Her tea water came from the river, so it was already brown before she made the tea. Me being the guy I was, I asked her what she was doing in Laredo. She had started out life working as a school teacher. Something went wrong. I don't know what, but she began losing touch with reality. She didn't tell me what happened, only that she had left her job and went looking for a better life, free from all the constraints of having a job, a home, and a regular life. She was happy living in her tent, which was actually a tarpaulin draped between a bunch of trees. Her wardrobe was what she had on the day the San Antonio police invited her to take a bus ride. Some of what she said made no sense at all. You had to sift out the facts from the imagination. Daniel W. Every agent, officer, firefighter, folks working downtown, they all knew Daniel. His nickname was Elvis. Daniel would stand in the middle of the street or even the highway sometimes and do his Elvis impersonation. He thought he could dance like that. To his mind, he looked like the king. To the rest of us, he looked like a half naked older man who should stay home. His hair was going gray, so to stay looking young, Daniel would smear black shoe polish over his head, which made his hair stick out in all directions. He had maybe 5 or 6 teeth, and he needed some dental attention. It was unpleasant to stand too close to him since his breath would kill a moose. He was very much a problem. He was known to grab people, and sometimes PD would haul him in on assault charges, but some judges are just too liberal, and Daniel would wind up back out on the streets. He had a cordless phone that he carried around, using it like it was a cell phone. He would stop any agents passing by and ramble on about all kinds of things. If you tried to leave, that's when he would grab your arm and try to hold on. If you had a reasonable amount of strength, you could easily pry his hand loose from your arm, at which point he would start screaming that you had broken his fingers, or his hand, or his arm. He would fall to the ground, screaming his head off. Tourists walking by would give us dirty looks, thinking that we had beat up this poor old homeless man, but the people living downtown, they all knew better. I was on the bike patrol several times. That was a neat way to do the job. You get to see things that most other agents never see. Driving around in a vehicle isolates the agents from a lot of the city. On a bike, you're right there. Citizens mostly really liked having us around. We tried to keep the crime down. We worked with the police bike patrol a lot. I'm still in contact with several of the officers that I worked with. Daniel had a friend. It's good to have a friend unless you use them for your own purposes. William. I don't want to call him a transvestite, but he did wear women's clothes. William had an old blonde wig from one of those old 60s mannequins. It was probably looked better several decades ago. He needed a shave if he was going to try and pass himself off as being female. He had, at one time, a bright blouse that more than likely was pulled from a trash can somewhere. Spandex pants are not a good look for about 90% of the people out there. His high heels needed a lot of mending. William had an acoustic guitar that he had duct taped a small amp to. So now he thought he was Mark Knopfler or something. He would play the guitar at Jarvis Plaza, and Daniel would dance. Live entertainment. The biggest problem was he would dance out in the street, forcing cars and buses to have to go around him. Any money, and there wasn't much, that William managed to collect was taken by Daniel to use for whatever he saw fit. Oddly enough, William always seemed to be happy. Daniel was just the opposite. He was always mad about something. Daniel had moved into what we called the Legion Gate house. Today it's the Webb County Museum. It was an old two-story mansion with most of the furniture still in. The library was full of books. Windows were missing and doors didn't lock, so homeless people would slip in for the night. One cold night, Daniel decided to start a fire on the second floor. He piled a bunch of books in the middle of the floor and lit them. A fire on a wooden floor is never a good idea. The fire department managed to save most of the building, and Daniel was a guest of the county for a few weeks until some judge decided to let him go again. Daniel began sleeping on the side of the highway. One of his favorite spots was on the on ramp just next to the Bruni Elementary School. There was a big bit of grass growing there, and this became Daniel's place at night. Many times the police or an ambulance was called about a dead body laying on the side of I 35. They would roll up and find Daniel asleep. This happened so many times that officers and the medics hardly even looked anymore. It's just Daniel again. Best leave him unconscious, because if they woke him, Daniel would go into one of his many weird actions. You could be stuck there for an hour. I was taking a paramedic class at LCC one year. I don't remember which year because I took several classes out there. I remember back when it was called LJC. As soon as we finished the test they were taking, we were allowed to leave. I was driving north on I 35 and I saw a bunch of cops standing around a body. I glanced over, but I kept going. It turned out it was Daniel. It was his last day on Earth. He had stepped out onto I 35 to dance and he got hit by an 18-wheeler that didn't bother to stop. His body bounced back onto the grass, and everybody just assumed he was asleep. Well, he was taking the big sleep. I have no idea whatever became of William. He just kind of faded into the background. The professor was an odd character. He had a shopping cart filled with textbooks, mostly on history. The cart was piled up to the top. He told me what he believed had happened. He had worked at some university up north. His coworkers had discovered that the professor had a kind of a soft spot, something he had done or said that the others thought was hilarious. They began to mock him and make nasty comments about him. As time went by, the professor began to get agitated, and eventually he began to slip his gears. One day, the professor simply walked away from his life and eventually wound up living on the streets of Laredo. He pushed that cart around all day, looking for some unknown location. Maybe he was looking for his sanity. On nice days when the temperature was below 100, the professor would wind up at Jarvis Plaza sitting on a bench or one of the walls. Jarvis Plaza was an entertaining place to visit. Day or night, you would find colorful people there. We cruised through Jarvis many times a day. One day I was working my way slowly along the north side, and my partner, Linda, was talking to somebody on the south side. A very well-dressed man surreptitiously got my attention. He was acting normal considering where he was standing. I pulled up next to him and asked what I could do for him. He whipped out his ID and held it up next to his head and said he was Agent Macklin with the FBI. His ID was actually a checkbook. I looked at the guy, I looked at the checkbook, and then I looked back at the guy, and I decided his elevator wasn't making it to the top floor. I asked him how I could help him. He told me that he was working on the JFK assassination and he thought that he had discovered a very good suspect. The FBI guy pointed across the plaza at where Linda was sitting on her bike. I asked if he meant the woman she was talking to, and he said no, the woman dressed to look like an agent. I was 5 years old when JFK got shot in Dallas, so my partner would have been 6. The FBI guy went on to give me all the details on why he believed that Linda was the chief suspect. I told the FBI guy I would keep an eye on her and report back if I discovered any new leads. Over the years, the FBI guy made a nuisance of himself, but never enough to get locked up. You couldn't even accuse him of pretending to be law enforcement using a checkbook. The reason so many colorful people hung out at Jarvis Plaza was just one of those things. The place was known as a hangout ever since people could remember. It was almost like a hot spot for weird and bizarre people. The Hamilton Hotel was across the street, and at the time it housed many people with major issues. The rent was very low. The Bender was just down the street. Both of these hotels had been luxury living establishments back in the day, but they had fallen on hard times and now they were seeing the lower side of life. Right in the middle of the plaza was a gazebo that the city had built, but I don't think anybody ever used it for anything. It sat about 6 feet up off the ground, and the stairs were removed. A man and his wife would stand by the gazebo, and he would play his guitar, and his wife would sing. Unlike William, this guy could actually play the guitar. He was no David Gilmour, but he was a lot better than William. Now, that's not saying much. They would preach about Jesus and then sing a few gospel songs. There was a woman that we called the Russian. She spoke with a thick Russian accent, kind of like from a 60s spy movie. Think of Natasha from Rocky the Flying Squirrel, for those of you my age. One day, as the man was playing and his wife was singing, the Russian woman was standing in the crowd, began to dance. She was very dynamic, and everybody around her began to move so they didn't get knocked over. She twirled and she gyrated, and it was kind of entertaining. Her movements had nothing to do with the music. The couple were playing gospel, and she was dancing to death metal. The Russian woman began to remove her clothing. It was getting weird fast. She undid her top and then threw it in the air. Then her skirt went to the ground. It was like a train wreck. You wanted to look away, but you couldn't. I wanted to leave, but I was glued to the spot. What can possibly happen next? The Russian woman got down on her knees and began drawing symbols on the sidewalk using a bottle of water that she had grabbed from somebody else in the crowd. As she was making weird sounds and waving one hand in the air. She was speaking a language I'd never heard. I was expecting a demon to appear at any moment. The couple stopped playing and they left. The crowd, mostly women waiting for a bus or colorful people waiting for who knows what, all just stood around unsure of what to do. The Russian woman grabbed her clothes and walked away down the street in just her underthings, acting as if nothing odd had just happened. Laredo isn't all that big of a town, and my dad began to have all kinds of weird problems, and we decided that we should put him somewhere with folks that could take better care of him. The facility we chose was great. The staff was pleasant, and I got to know all of them. The food was excellent. They had a chow hall that you could visit along with your relatives, and you could eat with them. The food was good. Have you ever spent time in a building filled with old folks? Old folks that some of them have a lot of issues? There was an old lady, usually sitting in a wheelchair. She would get upset by all the other women, especially the screamers and the yellers. This woman would yell at them to shut up. You could hear her over everybody else. She had a very thick Russian accent. I wondered, could this be the same Jarvis Plaza entertainer? There were a few clothing optional people in this facility. I asked her where she was from, and all she would tell me was she was from Russia. She liked my dad, but my dad didn't really like her. She was a little too aggressive. Downtown Laredo could be turned into a fantastic tourist attraction if the owners of the buildings would invest some money in them. Instead of fixing anything, the multi story buildings are left empty, with only the ground floors used as stores, selling mostly things that were heading into Mexico. Parking is a huge problem because the stores all need deliveries made, and the folks doing their shopping also need a place to park. The parking authority hands out thousands of tickets each year, and most of them wind up being thrown from the bridge that goes back into Nueva Laredo. A woman called Concha was an ongoing problem for the women selling purses and jewelry downtown. In the downtown area, you could get some Nike running shoes for $20 if you didn't mind that the swoosh was on upside down. You could get Oakleys, we called them Fakeleys, for $15. Those fancy handbags that women love so much, the ones that cost about $1,000, you could get them for 50 to $100 as long as you didn't look too closely at the craftsmanship or the lack thereof. Concha would walk along the streets, eventually entering a shop. She would take a new purse and then leave. Her husband was outside, not sure they were actually married or anything, but they acted like they were. He had a shopping cart filled with all the other purses that she had acquired. The cart was full. Concha was known to get violent with anybody that tried to stop her, so the stores just took the loss. If Concha got mad at her husband, she would leave him on a street corner for days, sometimes weeks. He would sit there waiting for her return, with a shopping cart full of purses as his only companion. Concha was known to get mad at her purse. Maybe that's why she had so many. She would start yelling at her handbag, holding it out at arm's length. Then she would set it on a bench or a wall and sit a few feet away from it. She would act like she was ignoring the bag, or she would turn and yell at it and scream at it and call it all kinds of names. Then she'd turn her back once more and pretend like it wasn't there. After an indeterminate amount of time, she would reach over and snatch up the handbag and walk away. One day she threatened to stab an officer on the bike patrol, and off to MHMR she went. Her husband wandered around town pushing the shopping cart, waiting for her return. Once again, he just kind of faded off into the background. I don't know if they ever got back together because she was in for a long time. Did you know the average shopping cart costs $300? That's why companies are putting devices on them to keep people from walking off with them. There was a big black guy. He was maybe 6'4", about 350 pounds. This guy was wearing a black snowmobile suit in Laredo in July. He had 3 shopping carts with briefcases in them. All these cases looked alike, leather with combination locks. They were high quality. They were all hooked together with cables and locks. There were maybe 10 or 12 in each cart. He would move along the street pushing one cart while leaving the other two not too far behind. He would park the first cart and go back and get the second and then the third. It would take him an hour to make just a few blocks. He kind of rotated around the old library and the bus station. Once again, he probably came from the San Antonio bus station. We would ride by several times a day, wondering who he was and what was in those cases. I began to spread the story that he was a runaway government agent with all kinds of Roswell evidence. It got to a point I wanted to know, but the guy was non communicado. He would ignore us as we rode by, and if we stopped close by, he would just act like we weren't there. If you talked to him, he would look off into space with a blank look on his face. He was in his own little world, and I still wonder today what was his past life and what got him to Laredo and what was in those cases. What if I'm right? A white guy showed up one day walking around asking where the bridge was. In Laredo at the time, we had 2 bridges into Mexico. Only one was for pedestrian traffic. He would stop an agent and ask, "Where's the bridge?" Which we would point out bridge number 1 at the end of Convent Street. This guy was not from around town. He spoke no Spanish. His white baseball cap had writing and symbols on it. Uh, Indecipherable nonsense. Runes that I didn't recognize. He was looking for the bridge to Mars. Somebody up north had told him there was a bridge connecting the Earth to Mars, and he had tracked it all the way to Laredo. Once in town, he had lost the trail. This guy vanished for a couple of months, only to show back up. I asked him where he'd been, and he told me that someone had said the bridge to Mars was actually in Monterrey, Mexico. So he hitchhiked down there. He searched all over Monterrey only to be told that he needed to return to Laredo. I think this might have been the authorities that told him that, trying to get this nuisance American out of their town. This guy wandered the streets for several months before heading to some other location in pursuit of the bridge to Mars. There was a homeless camp just off of I-35 north of Man Road. It's where the Lowe's store is today. One day, just for the thrill of it, we rode through the camp. There were 4 PD officers and 3 Border Patrol agents. We were all armed. We were all in uniform. We rode into that camp and it felt like all of us had targets on our backs. The overwhelming feeling of hostility was palatable. We were looking for all the illegal drugs these folks had, but we wound up just looking for an exit. When dealing with normal folks, you usually have a reasonable idea what to expect. When dealing with people with little to nothing to lose, you have no idea how they're going to react. The city finally moved in and they managed to take down the camp and then they built a hardware store there. I go there a lot. We had one man wandering around the gravel pit who said his name was Jesus. He was dressed appropriately if he were living in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. Long black hair and a beard, and a full-length white robe and sandals. When asked, he said his father's name was Joseph and his mother's name was Mary. Now, I know these are anglicized names, but this was his story and he was sticking to it. He wasn't the problem. He just walked around acting very Christ-like. Before we left, he would bless us. He did this to everybody that stopped to talk. One day he was gone. Nobody knows where he'd gotten to. Maybe his family came and got him. Maybe he decided Laredo was being saved and moved on to a better location. There was a crazy old lady who was very hostile. She would swear at anybody, accusing people of trying to do bad things to her, such as look up her skirt or get nasty with her. She walked all around the downtown area, and if she saw you, she would come over and start yelling at you. If we saw her first, we would turn and go the other direction. One day I was caught off guard, and she came around a corner right in front of me. She got right up close and demanded that I take some letters from her to the post office. She told me that I had better buy some stamps and put 'em on there for her. The post office was right across the street from where we were. She handed me this handful of letters and then stomped away, looking back to be sure that I wasn't trying to follow her. The letters were a bunch of unopened junk mail that she'd pulled out of a trash can. I saw her one day yelling at an empty street about bad things, and the unseen person was going to regret getting on her bad side. I never heard her say that when she was a little girl, she saw something nasty in the woodshed. Some of y'all will get that reference. Far too many of these soldiers of the road begging for money to buy drugs. One drug of choice is contact cement. You can smell it on their breath. The fumes get into their sinuses and accumulate. Other simply drink away their time on earth, thinking everything is better when seen through the bottom of a bottle. Stoned on some new poison they found upon a wall. Steppenwolf, for you music lovers out there. Very few ever sobered up, but I have seen a few. There was an old lady I would see around town. She had on several pairs of pants, each covering the holes in the one beneath. Sometimes she would have as many as 4 pairs of pants on. She had a dress with a skirt pulled on over the top of that. She probably hadn't bathed in a while, maybe a few years. Her eyes had that lost look of heavy drinking. The man takes a drink, then the drink takes a drink, then the drink takes the man. One day, maybe a year after last having seen her, I saw a well dressed young lady heading to a job somewhere. It took me several looks before realizing this was the multiple dress lady. She wasn't nearly as old as she had first looked. I hope she stayed sober for the rest of her days. There was a former soldier who hung out on Man Road. I asked him a few questions to be sure he was legit. He was able to tell me his MOS, where he did basic, where he was stationed. He knew what a DD 214 was. In fact, he had one folded up in his rear pocket. He would stand on the side of the road blessing cars as they went by. Sometimes he'd have a bottle of water and he would sprinkle it on the vehicles like it was holy water. His MOS was not chaplain nor chaplain's assistant, but he was behaving like one. I would buy him a hamburger every once in a while, and he was spending way too much time out in the sun, so I asked him if he'd like some sunscreen. He told me that several other agents had offered him sunscreen over the years, but he didn't use it. His skin was a dark, leathery, wrinkled thing that most white people like me get when we stay out in the sun too long. He had a cardboard sign that proclaimed that he needed money to buy beer. He would complain about all the drug users while standing there drinking beer. The ninja terrorist squeegee man was very bizarre. He was a young black kid with some odd behavior. He hung out around Mall del Norte, and I guess he lived somewhere in that area. He would stand on a street corner dressed in his costume. There was a checkered tablecloth on his head, like a gutra or a kufaya, only his looked more like a tablecloth. He had on some cheap dark sunglasses. He wore a black turtleneck sweater, black pants, and those ninja shoes called tabis with the space between the toes. In his hand, he held a squeegee up alongside his head, like that. He never moved. He never tried to clean anyone's windshield. He never moved as far as I could tell while he was standing there. I would drive around the block several times, and he was always in the exact same spot, in the same stance, sometimes for hours at a time. One day I did see him running naked around the mall. Like I said, naked people running around Laredo wasn't that big of a deal. Ugh, that which has been seen. He was being he was being chased by a bunch of cops. One of them was carrying a pair of pants, and I guess they belonged to this kid. I guess they were trying to convince him that he should put them on. If you've never seen about 6 or 8 cops chasing a naked man around a shopping mall, well, you just haven't seen weird yet. I've chased a few naked people on a few occasions. You try to do your best to do your job, but at the same time, you try to not catch the person. Uh, it's not like the dream where you're running around naked. It's somebody else's dream, I guess. The ninja terrorist Squeegee Man slept in the bushes alongside I-35. He didn't have a tent or any kind of possessions other than his costume and his trusty squeegee. After a few months, he just moved on to some new town. Randy was interesting. I met him while riding my own bike after I had retired. Randy was from Maine. He wound up in Laredo after having spent some time in San Antonio. He also told me about the police and their unofficial policy. Randy never told me his last name. He said he was trying to raise money to buy a car. He had a newspaper with a whole bunch of ads listing used cars for sale, and he had several were circled, and he was looking into them. He would sit on the corner of Hillside and Sandario on one of those walkers with a little seat, right next to the mall and across the street from the bank. I would see him sleeping on the bench near the old Kmart store where the Chick-fil-A is today. Any time I asked if he needed anything, Randy always said that he was fine, just trying to raise some money for a car. One day, he showed up driving an old beat up Blazer that he had just bought. This got me to wondering how much money were people giving him. He would disappear for a couple of weeks, maybe a month, and then he would come back and be sitting there at his favorite spot. He would sleep in the back of the Blazer, usually parked right there near the corner. He would tell me that he had been to Encinal and he'd been to El Cenizo and he'd been to a few other towns around the area, but he quickly discovered that if you wanted to raise money panhandling, Laredo was the place. Once he had his vehicle, he told me he was raising money to open a soup kitchen. Randy would come and go from that corner several times over the years. It's been 5 years since I last saw him, and my wife and I joke about the fact that he probably retired to Hawaii. Riding a bike around town almost makes a person invisible. I could sit and watch others, and nobody ever seemed to notice me or mind that I was watching them. The folks under the overpass are something else. At Colton and I-35, there are a bunch of people living up under the highway. They have all kinds of items, either bought or acquired over the years. They each have a cardboard sign proclaiming their need for money to feed their starving, non existent families or to buy a ticket to some place that they're never going to visit. All the signs have way too much writing on each, and it takes several minutes to read what all is written on them. If you take the time and read all of the writing, some of it doesn't make any sense at all. Mostly it just says they need money and God bless you for helping them. If you watch, you'll begin to notice that these signs get handed around back and forth amongst all of the street workers. They all work for one woman. She's about 4'8", maybe 4'10". She wears clothes that probably would look better on a teenager, a very thin teenager. When she walks, her exaggerated hip movement is comical to see. For such a small girl, she sure has a lot of people under her control. Smoking and drinking, uh, it's caused some damage to her looks. She looks to be about 40 or 50 years old, but I'll bet she's not that old. I've sat there and I've watched her as she hands out assignments to all of these others around her. She gets a cut from every dollar that they take in. She is the landlord of the intersection. I've seen her yelling at men twice her size because they didn't deliver the required amount of cash for working her intersection. What is truly amazing is how these folks manage to survive overdoses, cold weather, accidents, infections, eating things that they shouldn't eat, and consuming drugs and chemicals that their body doesn't need. They wind up in the emergency department on many occasions with breaks and bleeds and all kinds of weird illnesses and diseases, infections. It's as if living on the street makes them stronger because they wind up back there at their street corner begging for money. You may have recognized a few of these colorful people if you read my book, Flying Saucers Attack Walmart. It was my first attempt at writing a humor story. My idea of funny might not fit into your definition. You can still find it at Amazon. Someday I'm going to read it on Storytime with Chris James, my other YouTube channel. All the characters in the book, all the colorful folks, the people of Walmart, if you will, they're all based on people I've actually run into, to, people I've actually met, I've actually talked to. Bizarre folks like the FBI guy, William, and his friend Daniel. They're all in there. It's called Flying Saucers Attack Walmart, and you might get a chuckle out of it. I have to wonder what happens to these folks that nobody seems to want. Now, I'm no do gooder, but I do have a heart. I wonder if there's a family somewhere wondering what happened to their uncle, their aunt, their sister, or their brother, maybe even their father or mother. Wandered off one day, forgot to take their medication, or they simply disappeared one day. There's a website with hundreds of photos, both missing people and found people. Some are sketches drawn from memory, and there's a few obvious morgue photos. A body found with no ID and no known past. If they've never been in trouble with the law, there's very little chance that their fingerprints are going to be on file. If they were never in the military, of course. This is from years ago. Nowadays, I understand they fingerprint everybody. Just for fun, or just to mess with your mind. Next time you see some crazy person walking around talking to themselves or their imaginary companions, ask yourself, who is this person? Is there somebody out there wondering whatever became of their family member or close friend? Maybe you know this person. I've met and talked to so many people over the years, I've lost count and track of them all. Many who were quite certifiably crazy, others who were just tired of the day to day grind. Alcohol and drugs have led to a lot of people losing themselves, looking for happiness only to find misery. The people that think they have all the answers think what is needed is affordable housing. A lot of these folks don't have a housing problem. They have a problem fitting into society. They have a living problem. I'm smart enough to know I don't have any of the answers, just more questions. A few extra dollars to hand out once in a while. I'll bet some of these homeless folks have more money than I do. It is our duty to try to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves. If they're con artists, well, they're using the money for drugs or alcohol. It's their bad, not ours. If you don't know for a fact that this person is going to go buy beer or drugs, give them a buck. You're not enabling them. You're simply trying to be a nice person. Now, if you do know that this person is using the money for drugs and alcohol, then yes, you are an enabler. I do have standards. If the person begging for money has some brand new tattoos, they're not getting my money. The money that they spent on those tattoos could have gone to buy the food that they claim they need. If they're walking back and forth holding a beer can, which, yes, I have seen that, which, by the way, it's against the law to consume alcohol in public, at least in Laredo, they're not getting any money either. If they're smoking, nope, no money for them. Cigarettes are what, a $5 a pack today? Heck, they were 50 cents when I was in the Army. Too many scammers are mixed in with those in need. It's hard to sort out who's who. If you don't know, give them a buck. If you do know, they don't get money. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell people you don't even know. Heck, tell those homeless people out there on the street. They should be listening to Strange Things with Chris James. If you'd like to buy one of my books, help me keep this show going, you can find my books at Amazon.com. The Laredo Paranormal Research Society, Fort McIntosh and the Paranormal, Paranormal Laredo, and Paranormal Stories. And yes, if you'd like to read something that I think is funny, Flying Saucers Attack Walmart. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.